So thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Petra. And good morning to all of you. I wanted to start my talk with a few stories. I was raised by medical missionaries in India, and so I thought I would start with one story from the Bible, but it also appears in the Quran, and one from the land of my birth, India. The golden calf. Who remembers the story? Moses went to Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments from God, and while he was gone for 40 days and 40 nights, the Israelites started to fret. They thought he might never return, and so they took all of their gold and they melted it into a golden calf. Why a calf? Apparently bull worship was common in many cultures at the time. Some say it still is. Anyway, this is what they did, and they treated the golden calf as though it were a god, and they worshipped it. And when Moses returned, he was angry because they were not supposed to worship idols. So what is this story about? It's a story about being lost in the wilderness without a leader and turning to a false god, which then becomes an object of worship. Well, since World War II, gross domestic product, or GDP, has been the golden calf, the fetish of global economic policymakers. We have turned something that was supposed to be a mere indicator into a way of achieving almost any economic policy objective we could think of. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to review the deep critique of this golden calf, GDP, with a few examples, and also show at least one of the alternatives that is gaining more traction in the United States, namely the Genuine Progress Indicator. As Catherine mentioned, it is now in place in the state of Maryland and in Vermont, and soon it will be in place in the states of Oregon and Washington. 18 other states are looking at putting it into place. Okay, so let's start with one of the most nefarious uses of GDP, which all of you must be familiar with, which is that it has been used to invoke it as a tool for poverty eradication. We've all heard the simplistic slogan that the rising tide lifts all boats, the trickle-down economics is the way to grow the economy and help everyone, including the poor. So I will begin my talk there by illustrating just how twisted this logic is. And for that, I need to get the clicker and turn to India, the land of my birth. So this is a region called Orissa in eastern India that at one time was covered with forests where tigers and elephants roamed, where tribal people could find all that they needed from the herbs and plants and wildlife in the forests. But the World Bank came in and said they needed to address the issue of poverty alleviation and sustainable development. And in order to do so, they needed to raise the GDP of the country. They looked at the energy sector and they saw numerous assets in the form of coal and bauxite underground, but they saw equally enormous liabilities in the form of unionized coal miners, the second largest union in the country. And so they instructed the government of India to break the unions and turn the underground coal mines into open pit mines, a more economically efficient way of getting access to the coal. They made this method of open cast mining a criteria for getting loans. And the money began to flow, where once there were underground coal mines and thousands of miners working, now there were open pit mines with trucks carting out coal by the ton. Humble huts housing multiple families hug the edges of the coal mines. This is a group of women and children that had nowhere else to go. They had been displaced from their land, but without land title, they had nowhere to go. So they were living in communities where the temperatures could reach over 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Spontaneous combustion of coal in the open pit coal mines could not be extinguished. Water is polluted by coal-fired power plants, and far away, healthcare and education is non-existent. Where once there were fertile fields, there were now several football field-sized dumps for fly ash. But the World Bank didn't stop with these open pit mines. They also needed to ensure that whatever money was coming from the coal dug from these mines was money that could be used to repay the loans. And in order to do that, they needed so-called hard currency, or dollars, rather than rupees, which of course can only be earned by certain industries able to produce products for export, such as aluminum smelters. So we visited one of the aluminum smelters in Orissa, and we saw cattle dying in droves from bone-crippling fluorosis and other undiagnosed diseases. This boy had 7 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. All the malformed children were born after the aluminum smelter began to smelt aluminum. Many of the women cannot be married if the men learn where they're born. Bottom line, thanks to the World Bank policies focused on GDP growth in the energy sector, India's GDP has grown from 1.5% in the 1950s to 10% per year in 2010. Oh, and here are some of the beneficiaries of that GDP growth. Another end result is that the poorest in India are worse off, and they remain without electricity. Now, it's not just India that worships GDP. Of course, we in the US, the origins of gross domestic product, we do as well. We've become so accustomed to GDP as a barometer of economic health that when Hurricane Sandy hit New York City and New Jersey, one of the correspondents for CNN, as he stood in the raging waters of the Atlantic, said, "It's too soon to tell whether or not Hurricane Sandy will be good for GDP." These are the costs Americans paid out for climate change in 2012, according to the Natural Resources Defense Council. And these are the costs that we're paying out globally. Under GDP, this cost is considered a benefit, a sign of economic growth. But this $1.2 trillion a year should not count as a benefit. It should count as a cost. Let's see, so how did we get here? Although GDP was put in place after the Great Depression, it was never intended to avert future depressions. It was simply a tool to determine where goods and services were being produced. After the Depression, evidence was clear that the economy was in the tank, yet Congress lacked any tools to accurately measure just how bad it was. And so Congress asked economist Simon Kuznets, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Economics, to develop a method to assess the state of the national economy. In 1937, Kuznets presented a vast volume of data on income to Congress. It became gross national product. But Kuznets warned that his newly minted GNP should not be used as an instrument of social policy. Goals for more growth should be more growth of what and for what, Kuznets warned. Nevertheless, his new metric was put in place, and shortly thereafter Kuznets' warning on GDP went unheeded, and in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire, where the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN were created, gross domestic product became the barometer of health, not only for the US economy, but for the entire global economy. We've had people in our country warning for quite some time that GDP is not the correct metric to use to measure progress. Joseph Stiglitz, who teaches at Columbia University and received the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics, has written about what he calls the great GDP swindle. He reminds us that GDP doesn't measure the costs of income inequality, which are growing in our country, nor does it reflect quality, as in quality of health care. Our healthcare costs are among the highest in the world in the United States, but our outcomes are worse than many wealthy countries. In addition, GDP gives no indicator of sustainability. We could be headed for a fiscal or an environmental cliff, but GDP wouldn't give us any clue about it. So GDP as a metric of economic well-being fails on a number of levels. This slide begins to explain its many failings. And when a country like Liberia focused exclusively on GDP growth at the expense of human health, this is one consequence: Ebola, a problem for all of us now. Air pollution is not considered a cost measured under GDP, but it's very real. When you look at China, this is a #1 concern. Okay, so we know GDP is the wrong metric, but what other options are there? As I like to say, using GDP to measure whether or not our nation is on the right track is like taking your temperature with a yardstick. Perhaps it was the great economic crisis after the Great Depression or recession of 2008 that inspired Governor Martin O'Malley in Maryland to begin to question GDP. After all, gross state product, gross domestic product had not warned the country of the coming economic crisis. It had blindsided us. So in 2010, Governor O'Malley became the first state, the first jurisdiction in the world to put in place an alternative to gross domestic product and gross state product, the genuine progress indicator. Of course, a new indicator by itself is of little worth, but if it is used as a guide to economic policy, as GDP has been in the past, not only in India and the United States, but globally, it can be a powerful catalyst for social change. So what is the genuine progress indicator and what are its limitations? The technical description of the genuine progress indicator is that it is a monetized measure of sustainable economic welfare or well-being. Each of these terms has a meaning, so let's think about them one at a time. As this slide shows, and I guess I didn't get a mic, so I can't walk over there and read it for myself, but when we say monetized, benefits and costs that can be expressed in monetary terms, that's what it means. However, this has its own limitations. In other words, benefits and costs that cannot be expressed in monetary terms are not included. It's an indicator, meaning that it's just an indicator of how we're performing. It's not a comprehensive measure. And when we say sustainable, we mean non-declining for generations to come. But that, of course, has a great deal of uncertainty, since we are, in some cases, guessing whether or not sustainability is, in fact, going to non-decline for the generations to come. It's limited to our consumption of goods and services, so it is not an indicator of happiness or well-being in any other domain. It's now annually updated with data from all the various departments in the state's government. 2 years after Maryland put the GPI in place, Vermont did the same, and now a series of states are considering following Maryland's lead. So what aspects of well-being are measured? These are some of the aspects, the 3 major factors. The economic benefits we receive from consumption of goods and services. Secondly, the economic benefits we receive from social and community assets like neighbors helping neighbors, public parks, public projects, infrastructure, as well as the economic costs that are often hidden from view, like air pollution, like homelessness. These include the costs of environmental degradation, poverty and crime, and spending on items like insurance that are not actually consumed. So this is a rather technical document, but it was done by my colleague, Dr. John Talberth, who is one of the economists that helped develop the Genuine Progress Indicator. He looked at the city of Baltimore through using the GPI lens and made a number of calculations that essentially put forward some of the positives, but also some of the negatives, like income inequality, pollution, the costs of underemployment, the cost of commuting, and came up with a much different figure than Baltimore would have developed if it had just looked at gross state product, or in this case, gross city product. So, recognizing that the GPA, that the Genuine Progress Indicator provides a much better indication of the true state of Maryland's economy than gross state product, this graph shows how the GPI has actually gone up roughly a little bit per year, but then it's leveled off and is now actually declining. So the critical perspective that the GPI brings on growth is that it asks three basic questions. Growth in what? Growth for whom? And growth at what cost? With respect to the growth in what, the GPI indicates that large portions of what passes for growth is growth in defensive expenditures, like on healthcare, commuting, insurance, higher energy bills. With respect to growth for whom, the GPI reveals and is sensitive to the fact that most of what passes for growth is actually growth in spending by the wealthiest 1%. As we all know, median income for most of us has been stagnant or falling for quite some time. And since the Genuine Progress Indicator incorporates income inequality, it is not surprising that part of the reason why the GPI has not grown at the pace of gross state product is because the costs of income inequality continue to grow larger year by year. And with respect to the growth at what cost, the GPI clearly reveals that economic growth in Maryland has been accompanied by increasing economic costs in the form of air and water pollution, lost forests, lost farmland, lost wetlands, climate change, and social ills such as lost leisure time and family breakdown. All these aspects of growth revealed by the GPI add up to the fact that Maryland's economy has not been growing at all for many years now. And so those who need to reconcile with this fact take a hard look at the GPI and see that it's starting to make some major changes in economic policies. They've begun to make major changes in economic policies to focus on genuine progress rather than economic activity alone. So this naturally brings us to the question of how the GPI can be used to guide policy. Now, as this cartoon, I think, makes pretty clear, the fundamentals of the economy often ignore the things that are fundamental to many of us. Yet the GPI, what it does is essentially allows us to begin to explore issues that are fundamental to us, like income inequality. So we did a study using the Genuine Progress Indicator, and we explored how Maryland would be better or worse off were it to return to the state of income inequality that existed in 1968. We asked whether or not equitable distribution of income would have an impact on the state overall. Income inequality in Maryland is at an all-time high, with the richest fifth earning on average $1 million per year, while the bottom fifth of taxpayers don't even make $30,000. What we found in our study was rather striking. Working through the GPI column by column and incorporating a wealth of information from inequality studies from around the country and in Maryland, we found that the GPI would be over $65 billion higher each year if modest measures were taken to improve the income of the lowest 2/5 of Maryland taxpayers. And to put that into broader perspective, the entire state budget for Maryland is roughly $32 billion. But that was a look backward. We also wanted to use the GPI to inform policies moving forward. How can we use the GPI to reduce income inequality? As Nelson Mandela reminds us, poverty is not an accident, and it can be removed by human beings. So in the U.S., we have a technique whereby when legislation is introduced, it needs to be reviewed for its economic impact on the government. In Maryland, it's the Department of Legislative Services that completes what is known as a fiscal note to help meet this need. The fiscal note considers the effects of new legislation on government finances, tax revenues, and expenditures, and also attempts to analyze effects on small business. Perhaps you have something like that here in Ontario. This, of course, needs leads to a very limited understanding of how legislation affects the economy, since fiscal notes do not consider effects on economic well-being of Maryland households or individuals. So we are promoting what we're calling a GPI note, one that takes any new piece of legislation and examines how it would impact the 26 indicators that comprise the GPI, thus providing a more comprehensive understanding of legislative impacts on economic well-being. And the GPI note can initially be done in a qualitative manner, as shown here for this is the minimum wage bill that recently passed in the state of Maryland. And prior to introduction of and passage of the minimum wage bill, the only thing that was being commented on in the media was the cost to small business, which, as you can see, is that little where that red arrow goes to. That was the focus of the conversation. But once you broadened, using the GPI, broadened the conversation to look at all of the benefits and began to put them, quantify them, you realized that there were enormous benefits that would begin to accrue for Maryland overall. Now, it's not just income inequality that is a critical component of the genuine progress indicator. It can also play a wide role in a wide array of public policy issues, from land use plans and economic development to tax policy, budgeting decisions, and infrastructure choices. So, returning to that story of that I began with in India. If we were to use the genuine progress indicator, we would see the costs of water pollution accounted for, the cost of air pollution, the loss of primary forests, the cost of CO2 emissions, the cost of depletion of non-renewable resources, the costs of income inequality, the actual value minus the foreign investment of spending in the state of OMSSA. And that actually gives us a better picture of whether or not this particular region of India is better off and the people are better off. So Maryland is ground zero for this change in what some call the structural DNA of our world. And Vermont is next, and other states and countries are next. Might Ontario consider putting the genuine progress indicator in place? Groups such as yours can help us take it to the next level. We're working with nonprofits such as yours in the state of Maryland, who are also trying to bring a greater sense of value to the services they provide the poorest in the state. Essentially, in sum, the genuine progress indicator helps evaluate the trade-offs with greatest economic benefit and helps get the greatest return on investment that will enhance social and economic well-being. Maryland is, of course, not alone in calling for moving beyond GDP. There has been a global call to measure welfare, not just output. In fact, at the Earth Summit Plus 20 a couple years ago, this was on the agenda. Nevertheless, we're moving forward one state at a time, with Maryland starting, Vermont continuing, Oregon and Washington, where I am now, about to put it in place. And we're learning by doing, and we really want to work with you to achieve success in moving beyond GDP. How we do that, how we use it in the months and years to come, determines whether or not it will be meaningful or yet another indicator that sits on the shelf. So this is our team. If you'd like to get in touch with us, we'd love to be in touch. Dr. John Talberth, who couldn't be here today, is available to work with you on developing the genuine progress indicator in this country. To continue to learn more about the work that we're up to, please do visit these websites, genuineprogress.net, sustainableeconomy.org. We also have a Facebook page and a Twitter feed. And I want to thank you very much for your attention.